Hi guys. Okay, so here we go. Yay, we're finally to the animal kingdom. And we're starting out in chapter 16 with some organisms that you might not necessarily, well, you probably don't consider them as animals because you may not know about them. Um, so we're going to kind of start small and then we'll move up to the different phylums, the different classes and orders, and they will gradually get bigger and things that we're a little bit more familiar with. But we're starting with the sponges and cnidarians in this chapter. We'll talk about worms and echinoderms and all kinds of stuff. So this is a pretty big chapter, and we'll do our first dissection. Actually, our first and second dissection is part of this chapter. And yeah, I hope you'll like it. This is my favorite part of biology. So here we go. So we're starting with invertebrates. Those are animals that do not have a backbone. Except for phylum Chordata, every other phylum in the animal kingdom is invertebrate. Okay, so it's much more common as an animal to not have a backbone if you're looking at the numbers. So here we go. We're talking about sponges, and they are in phylum Porifera. And they're invertebrates, like I said. They have no germ layers. And the introduction that we did the first day of this chapter, this was one of the questions, but germ layers are different cell layers as the organism is developing that further develop into part of the like the digestive system, like the gastrodermis or the muscle system or the epidermis. These guys are just, there's not a lot of remarkable stuff about them as far as, parts go. So no germ layers. They don't have any major systems, like they don't have a nervous system, no brain. They don't have a digestive system for their whole organism because their cells basically do everything for themselves. They don't have a circulatory system, same thing. As adults, they do not move. They will attach to a point somewhere on the ocean floor or down, the bottom of a lake or a pond, and pretty much stay there. They have asymmetrical growth, so that's another term that you guys looked at, which means that they don't, their two halves won't mirror each other. But they are multicellular. They do have eukaryotic cells, so that is just like you. They are heterotrophic, which means they have to take in food from other organisms, or other organisms are food to them in some cases. But they do develop from a zygote. They do develop from a combination of egg and sperm. They can live in marine environments, so saltwater or freshwater. And they really vary in size. They can be 1 centimeter, really small, up to about 2 meters across. Typically, the bigger sea sponges are found in the ocean. They're more common there. Typically, like the pictures, they're much more colorful in the ocean. The freshwater sponges are kind of a dull color. And typically, if you're counting them out, you're always going to have way more marine species than freshwater species. So they are considered animals. Again, not what we typically would say is our favorite animal. Okay, so structure and then reproduction. Sponges basically are a tube that is open at one end. They have spicules that are kind of a support network. They form the shape of the sponge. The spicules can be really stiff, kind of like needles, or sometimes they're made of what is called spongin, and these are much softer fibers that help kind of form the shape of the organism. The spongin ones are the ones like you can buy freshwater sponges and like use them as like a bath sponge, like a loofah. The spicule sponges are harder. Like people have them for like decoration and stuff. Sponges have many holes in them, hence the name sponges. And their fancy name is poriferans, which means pore bearers, so hole bearers. And so they have this opening, and the opening itself, like the cavity inside the body of the sponge, is lined with collar cells. Collar cells are cells that have a flagella on them, and so the flagella is in there kind of waving around, and that creates a current, and that moves water from the bottom and the sides of the sponge and out the top. So remember, they got holes, so the water gets drawn in from the sides, or closer to the bottom, and then it gets, my hands can't get in there, and then it just gets pushed out the top of the sponge. And each cell inside there engulfs food particles, partially digests, gets some nutrients out of it, and then passes it on to other cells in the organism. And so it's almost like a colony in that they kind of live together and are support for each other, and they're all pretty much the same. The opening in the sponge is called the osculum, and so this is where waste products are ejected. They move out into the current, and they basically just kind of eat what comes in. Okay, so with reproduction, sponges do reproduce asexually. Remember, that just means they make a clone. They can form new organisms through budding, so similar to like the yeast that we talked about a couple of chapters ago, where there's just a growth, and that growth breaks off and it becomes a new organism. Some sponges, particularly freshwater sponges, form what is called a gemule. And this is where you have a group of cells that are in like a little reinforced, like a seed almost. It's a little packet that is usually produced during kind of rough times, not enough food, the water level is not great or whatever it is. And so it's kind of like a little seed or a spore. And once the conditions get ripe again, or not ripe, once the conditions get better again, the organism kind of opens up and then grows. And then regeneration, if you chop a sponge in half, then it will grow into two new sponges. Pardon me, sexually, sponges are hermaphroditic, which means they have both male and female reproductive organs. And so they will, every sponge will release sperm into the current, out into the water. And that sperm has the possibility of entering into another sponge. If it enters and fertilizes an egg, then that will form a zygote. The zygote remains attached to the mother sponge, the one that had the egg, and it will over time become a larva that has a flagella on it, so it can swim, and it will swim away and find a rock or some place to attach and then grow into an adult sponge. So there is no, they don't mate, they don't, fall in love and, have baby sponges. They just release sperm, release this reproductive gamete, and, if it's just by chance, it actually fertilize another egg. All right. Onto our next phylum. These are the cnidarians, and they are, these are like jellyfish is a cnidarian, corals, anemones, and they are a little more, I kind of feel like we're getting closer to animals somehow as we keep kind of moving up here, but they have soft, radially symmetrical bodies, which means kind of like a pie. You can cut them along any of the midlines, and so they're kind of circular, and you'll have symmetrical parts. They do have two germ layers, so now we have specific cell layers that are doing specific things. The epidermis is the outer layer, and it is there for protection. And then the gastrodermis is the inner layer. It lines the gastrovascular cavity, which is kind of the hole in the middle, and performs digestion. So that's the gastro part. In between those two layers is a little layer called the mesoglia, and it's just like a little gel that kind of keeps them separate. Food and things that have been digested can move through the mesoglia into the epidermis, so that all the cells are nourished. Okay, so now the structure and reproduction in cnidarians, and I apologize, I know these pages are kind of packed, but I just kind of want to get it all on there. So they have a nervous system, and it is a nerve net, which is basically just a series of connected nerves. There's no one central point, though, like a brain. But so there is some movement based on the nerve net. some awareness that like one part of the body is touching, then the other parts no. Now, as far as like excretion, like getting rid of waste, that's a cell-to-cell process. So no circulatory system. Respiration, again, taking in oxygen, but also producing energy, that is on a cellular level. Most cnidarians are supported by water. They don't have any true muscle. They're just tissue. The exception is coral. A coral surrounds itself or kind of makes itself a little protective exoskeleton out of calcium carbonate. Cnidarians have two body forms. A polyp, which is this kind of first little picture right here, this little guy. And it is kind of a cup shape at one end. There with tentacles around it. And around its mouth, and then at the other end, so down here, this end is a basal disc, and it attaches to things. Most polyp forms are not going to move, but if they do, like if the conditions where they are poor, no food or whatever, they can release, but then they just kind of float with the current. The medusa is what we typically think of as a jellyfish. So you have a kind of a bell-shaped body that swims, and swims is kind of a loosely connected word there, because they're not like, it's not like they're out there doing the freestyle or anything, but they do move by contracting like the margins of their body. So the bell itself kind of contracts in and kind of pushes. It has tentacles that it uses to bring organisms in that it wants to eat, and so like I said, this is like what we think of as a jellyfish. Most cnidarians actually go through both a polyp and a medusa life stage. And so they might kind of start as one and then develop into the other. Oh my goodness, hang on. Okay, so now structure continues. So those tentacles. The tentacles are lined with cnidocytes, and these are stinging cells. Every cnidarian is named a cnidarian because it has cnidocytes. And the cnidocytes have a little coiled tube in them that kind of acts like a spring or a release, and that is attached to a little barb. And so when something brushes up against them, when it triggers or hits this little trigger right here, it causes the barb, which is altogether called a nematocyst, to be released, and it injects toxin into whatever it has touched. The toxins, depending on how strong they are, different jellyfish and different cnidarians have different types of toxins. The toxin can paralyze the prey or kill it. I personally, thankfully, have never been stung by a jellyfish, but if for a person who comes in contact with the average jellyfish, it just stings really bad, apparently. Like I said, I don't really know. But if whatever is stung is small enough, pardon me, then the tentacles kind of wrap around it and they draw that fish or whatever it is into the mouth and then further into the gastrodermis, and it gets digested. Anything that can't be digested just comes back out the mouth. Yeah. Oh, goodness, I did it again. Okay, so now reproduction. Cnidarians can reproduce asexually, again, make a clone of themselves. Some of them just kind of can split themselves in half. So you have two identical copies. Some produce buds. You see this very often in the polyp forms, like the sea anemones. Cnidarians, though, in some cases do reproduce sexually, and they are not hermaphroditic, so they are either male or female. Okay, so they are one or the other. And again, it's not, they don't mate, they don't, have a mating season or, see each other and fall in love, but they just release their gametes into the water and, kind of see what happens. And so they release egg and sperm. If they come in contact, the right egg with the right sperm, then fertilization occurs. You have a zygote that is formed, and that zygote very quickly goes through cell division and forms a blastula. And this is just a little ball of cells. It becomes a flagellated larva, which means it can swim, and then that develops into either the polyp or the medusa body form. So again, we do have different characteristics that can be passed on, like all this. There's genetic stuff going on, obviously, with this, but still no true, like, having a baby kind of a thing. Okay, so now in the environment, what's the big deal about these guys? First off, in their larval stages, so the early developmental stages, they are a big part of the plankton in bodies of water. So they're kind of the bottom of the food chain. Sponges act as filter feeders, which means they help clean out the water that they are in. They can be parasitic. Sponges can live on the bodies of other organisms and be harmful just because of the kind of the conditions that they attach under. Some sponges will form symbiotic relationships with algae, and the algae makes the food, photosynthesis, and it passes the food to the sponge, and the sponge is a place for the algae to live. Anemones tend to form symbiotic relationship with certain fish species. The fish act almost like bait for the anemone because other fish will swim closer and then be stung and then eaten. And the anemone provides a safe place because bigger fish will not come too close because they won't be stung and that kind of stuff. There are certain fish species like clownfish, like think of Nemo, we could learn a lot from Nemo, that have the ability to kind of withstand the sting of an anemone, and so that's why they live there. Coral form coral reefs. They basically form entire ecosystems for different organisms that just need kind of a protected environment to live. Fish and sponges and other small animals will live within these coral reefs. The coral reefs help kind of break the waves as they come in towards land, and so that helps to stop erosion. One thing to note, it's in the news every once in a while, but coral reefs are endangered right now. Over 60% of them by now are endangered just due to human interference and pollution. Approximately, again, I'm sure it's higher than that, 10% of the coral reefs have already died, and they don't come back. And so it takes a long time to form. So it's one of those things that environmentally we need to kind of be aware of. Okay, so worms. Here we're doing all the exciting stuff this chapter. So worms. So we've got three major groups of worms, so three phylums. So in general, worms have a long, soft body. They are bilaterally symmetrical. Well, it's hard to say, which basically means if you cut them straight down, like between their eyes, where if they had eyes, and all the way down from top to bottom, you'd have two mirror halves, but you can't cut them any other way and get something symmetrical. So they have bilateral symmetry. They also have cephalization, and this means that they have a head region where their sensory organs and their nerves are concentrated. You have the same thing because you have a brain in your head, and you have eyes and nose and mouth and ears, and all your senses, or not all of them, but the majority of your senses start right here. So yay, you're like a worm. Anyway, worms' bodies develop from 3 cell layers or 3 germ layers. The epidermis, outer layer, mesodermis, middle, kind of muscle, and then gastrodermis is digestion. So here are 3 worm phyla. We have the flatworms. These are officially called from phylum Platyhelminthes. You have roundworms, which are phylum Nematoda, and then phylum Annelida, or the segmented worms. The roundworms and the segmented worms you may be a little bit more familiar with. The flatworms are typically in bodies of water. You don't see them necessarily a lot. They do, we'll talk about them more later because they do have certain species within that phylum that are parasitic. The roundworms, again, you don't come in contact with these a lot, but they do also act as parasites. This is like if you give your dog heartworm pills, it's because you want to prevent roundworms. Segmented worm is like an earthworm. Okay, so here we go. Lots on here. So structure of worms. First thing to know is that it is extracellular digestion, which is what you do. The worm's digestive system breaks down the food before it enters the cell. So just like our stomach and our intestines do all of that work before it gets to our cells, same thing for a worm. An exception are tapeworms because they are parasites and they basically just absorb nutrients from their host, so they don't have a digestive system. Nervous system, they have two bundles of nerves that are called ganglia that are concentrated in one area. So it's like a little kind of a mini brain. And those are connected to the surface and to the sensory organs there. In segmented worms, you have a closed circulatory system, which means actual vessels that carry the nutrients in and around the body. When we dissect our earthworm, we'll see that, or at least we'll kind of see where they are. Flatworms are so flat that they can just use diffusion, like the nutrients just kind of spread from one cell to another. Roundworms have kind of an open system, so with open fluids in their body cavities. Breathing wise, the respiratory system, worms breathe through their epidermis, so their outer covering. It's one of the reasons that earthworms come to the surface when it rains a lot, because they're basically suffocating down there. They can't get any oxygen, so they come up to the surface. The excretory system, so getting rid of waste. This happens through their epidermis, just like through their skin, or through their anus. Again, when we look at earthworms, we will see that, but that's how they get rid of solid waste. Some flatworms and some segmented worms have flame cells, which are used to remove like nitrogen waste, and this is really good because it benefits the soil, because then that's in their waste that they get rid of, and the soil is enriched. Roundworms have excretory cells that release the waste out of their body. Okay, reproduction in cells now. Most of them are hermaphroditic, so they do contain male and female reproductive organs. Asexually is not very common, but some of the parasitic worms can just kind of split themselves. Some of them also release like a body segment that contains, the kind of the starter packet for another worm, the necessary components for growth. So it's like a tapeworm will do that. Sexually, they can have internal or external fertilization. So that can happen inside the host's body, so like in the mom, or in water or soil. Earthworms lay eggs in like kind of a cocoon that hatches at some point. Some worms hatch in a water environment, and they form what is called a trochophore that then develops into a worm. Parasitic worms, we kind of talked about, can release fertilized eggs when in their host's feces. So when the host goes to the bathroom, the eggs are released. So all kinds of ways to reproduce. Okay, so in the environment, one big one to talk about are the parasitic worms. And this is that picture, which I know is kind of ooky to look at. That is the head of a tapeworm. And it is obviously taken with a microscope, but these parasitic worms, first off, have fewer sensory organs as adults. So there are no eyes, nothing to help them sense light or anything like that. They don't have any real nervous system. They don't have external cilia to help them move. They do have a very thick outer covering called a tegument, because they are typically in your intestines, where it's very acidic and lots of digestion still going on. And then they typically have some kind of way for attaching to the host, either the little suckers that you see there, kind of the circles, or the hooks. So yeah, they're not super pleasant to look at, but I do want to kind of run through some life cycles. Okay, so with the flukes, we've got the sheep liver fluke. So the ultimate host, the definitive host, I guess you could say, is a sheep in this case. So we'll start at the beginning. Eggs are produced by the adults. They leave the sheep's body when it goes to the bathroom. If the eggs happen to be in water, then the eggs will hatch. They become a little ciliated larva, and it will enter a certain type of snail that is typically found in the water. Now, sheep go to the bathroom wherever, so that's, so it's kind of random if the eggs land in water or not, but enough of them do. But anyway, so it enters into a snail. It continues to go through growth and different developmental stages. And then eventually it burrows its way back out of the snail. And it does this when the snail is out of the water and in grass or in soil somewhere that, well, no, not really even soil, but it really has to be grass, I guess. But when the fluke leaves the body of the snail, it will kind of squirm its way up on a blade of grass and form a cyst, or like a seed, again, kind of on this piece of grass. And the cyst, along with the grass that it is on, gets eaten by sheep, because, again, sheep are not real picky. And there it develops into an adult organism. It ends up, it kind of works its way through the sheep after it grows, and works its way over to the liver and just sets up shop. And again, they are harmful to the sheep in the long term. That's what parasites do. And they're typically really hard to get rid of if you have some kind of fluke infection in a pasture or in a water source. But one way to get rid of them is to remove the sheep. Eventually, the pasture will come back, but it is hard for the sheep to be truly healthy. But you can treat them. It's just not always the easiest. Okay, so then tapeworms. This is such a fun little section, isn't it? Tapeworms, these are a human parasite. And so an adult spends its life in the small intestine of its human host. And while there, it produces what they call proglottids. And these are little segments, little sections of the worm that produce thousands of eggs. When that person goes to the bathroom, the proglottids leave the body. So they leave the body in the waste. And if those proglottids end up in a water source or in a food source, they can be eaten most often by pigs. Again, pigs not super picky on where they eat. Now, here in the US, this is not a real common thing because we have, water systems. We have clean water sources. We don't have a lot of animals and people living in super duper close connection, but it happens. And so if these pigs do eat the proglottid, the eggs then will hatch in the pig's intestine, and they then will burrow their way out to the muscle and form a cyst there, which is, again, like just kind of a little hard, or, like a little protected area. And they're typically called bladder worms. Humans eat pork, which we do. We like our bacon. And if that pork hasn't been properly cooked, it doesn't kill the cyst. And so if you ingest this cyst, it will hatch in a person, that's the definitive host, and do it all over again. As that food moves through the digestive tract and through the small intestine, they will just attach to the wall of the intestine and hang out there. A person who has a tapeworm typically has some deficiencies in the amount of nutrients that they are getting from their food because the tapeworm is eating it. They can be removed surgically. They can be removed, I think, with medication that you can take that will kill the worm and not kill you, but you do have to get them out of your body. And so they, again, can be pretty detrimental health-wise. Okay, so worms. So we talked about the gross stuff. They are used for some good things. Leeches are used in skin graft patients. It helps to prevent blood clotting, and allows blood vessels to kind of heal themselves, grow together. So if you're trying to get new skin to grow, you want the blood vessels to get, to go into that new skin. Some parasitic worms are actually used for pain relief. If you have people who have chronic immune system issues, certain forms of arthritis, or things where their own immune system is too active, certain worms will actually lower a person's immune response. So it might make them more likely to get sick from other things, but it won't be that their own body is attacking them. Earthworms are decomposers in soil, so they are They just basically move through soil with their mouth open, and it goes in, it's digested and leaves their body. But typically, as part of that digestion process, they do change or add some minerals, and then that helps the soil get better. Earthworms also make little holes and burrow as they go through the soil, and so they aerate the soil, and that helps the roots of the plants have more access to air and to more water. Some of you may aerate your lawns in the spring, and it's where you like have this little contraption. It's like a wheel with spikes on it, and you roll it over your grass and it makes little holes. Okay, mollusks. Okay, so here we are with mollusks. This is the second largest animal phylum, believe it or not. The largest is arthropods. It's because those are where the insects are. But anyway, mollusks. There are 3 groups of mollusks. So this on the picture there is a bivalve. So those are things like oysters, mussels, scallops, clams. They have 2 shells. So that's the bivalve. The bi, remember, means 2. They live in water. They need the water because it brings their food to them, basically. They kind of a unique thing. They have a mantle, which is a tissue that surrounds their organs. And then they have a foot, not like our foot, of course, but a muscle that moves the animal. And so it is how they can move. They're not like, of course, super speedy, but they can move by using that foot to kind of push themselves along. Then second group, we have gastropods. Those are slugs and snails. The word gastropod means stomach foot. And so their foot, just like with the bivalve, is what moves them. So it's on this picture, it's kind of the bottom part right there. And then their stomach is right above it. So stomach foot is where that name comes from. These can live on land and in water. They have kind of modified gills. And in some cases that the shell kind of helps them kind of take their water with them and helps them to continue to be able to breathe, essentially. Inside their shell, they have the visceral mass, and this is where their organs are, heart and digestive organs. And then we have the cephalopods, and so this is an octopus, a squid, a cuttlefish, all those guys. That word translates into head foot, and in this case the foot has actually been split into all of the different tentacles, and then the head is kind of the body. These live in water, and they all have sucker-bearing arms that help them attach to prey as they are hunting, but also help them to move. In some cases they kind of crawl, and so those are kind of the big 3, and they're kind of tied together by the process, or by the presence in some cases of what they call a shell. Even though it's kind of odd because like things like that octopus obviously do not have a shell, they do have an internal type shell called a pen, a P-E-N, that helps them maintain some of their structure. And it's when we dissect our squid, we will kind of see the pen. Okay, so big page. So in mollusks, we've got 3 germ layers: the epidermis, the mesoderm, the gastroderm. They do have cephalization. Remember, that means that they have heads where their brain and their sensory organs are. They are bilaterally symmetrical like us. So you kind of right down between their eyes and down to from top to bottom, and you'll have 2 mirror images. They've got a digestive system, so stomach, kind of intestine, kind of, it's different than ours, but they do have something to digest for their other cells in their body. A circulatory system, a nervous system, some of them very well developed, and a respiratory system. So the nervous system can be very simple, like worms, and have just ganglia or clusters of ganglia, kind of together but small. But then some of them have very large clusters of ganglia that look more like a brain, like almost like a vertebrate brain. Cephalopods in particular are known to have fairly high levels of intelligence. They have shown the ability to solve very simple problems. They can, like open a jar to get food out, or some of them like, how to move from like place to place through certain, like a route that they would take. So they can be very smart, and and solve problems. The respiratory system, it's gills for mollusks that live in water. It's a modification, of gills for animals that move between land and water, so the gastropods. In a cephalopod, it's a closed circulatory system, so like yours with vessels. It's open in the bivalves and gastropods, which basically means they have a heart that's kind of at the top. When it pumps, the blood kind of flows over the organs underneath it, and then there's kind of a catching, like a bowl at the bottom, that it then kind of cycles the blood back up to the heart, contracts, flows over, keeps going that way. Digestive system, bivalves are filter feeders, so whatever they bring in, they filter out what they can eat. Gastropods and some of the cephalopods use a radula. It's kind of like a stick with teeth on it that kind of scrape food into the mouth. Some of the bigger cephalopods are predators, and so they will use their arms to pull prey into their mouth, and they have a beak in the kind of the center of their mouth, so it's not like they're not chewing like we are, but it really does actually look like a bird's beak that we'll see when we dissect our squid. They have siphons that move water in and out of the body, so they help to circulate the water. They, in some cases, help propel the organism. Some cephalopods can shoot out ink to distract predators. Some of them can camouflage their skin, can change their coloring so that they are hidden more easily. So these are really unique organisms. Super cool. Okay, so reproduction, they mostly, there's very few exceptions, so they reproduce asexually. Some use external fertilization, release the egg, release the sperm, and hope that they meet and produce a zygote. Some use internal fertilization, where the egg stays in the mother's body, and then it is fertilized by sperm from a male. Eggs are produced in some cases that release a larva. The larva is very small. It's part of the plankton, part of the bottom of the food chain, but it grows and changes and matures into an adult form, so it goes through a form of metamorphosis. Some cephalopod eggs release miniature versions, so they release tiny little octopus, and they're super cute. Okay, and last but not least for this slideshow, mollusks, as far as feeding, are carnivores. They eat other, they're meat eaters. Some of them are herbivores and eat algae and kelp and those kinds of things. Some of them are scavengers that eat kind of whatever they come upon. So they, in some cases, help kind of clean up the environment, and some help control populations. So it's a pretty broad group. They do, a lot of them, the smaller ones, live in coral reef communities for shelter, which means they then, are food sources in some case, but also help be part of that food pyramid. Some mollusks are food for us, so they do contribute to our diet. And quite a few of them have been studied for medical reasons because of their ability to regenerate. So if they lose a body part, or like an arm, one of their tentacles, and it can grow back. And so we're kind of studying that. Okay, so that's the end of this slideshow. We will, though, in chapter 16 also cover echinoderms. So we'll do kind of a book thing for that. But this is a broad chapter with a bunch of things that you may not consider animals, but are still really cool. So as always, if you have a question that I don't get answered on this video or in class, ask me. And I hope you guys enjoy this. I will see you in class.